But first, the Albanese government today split with the United States and voted with the UN to demand Israel call off its war against Hamas and instead agree to a ceasefire. Here's Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong announcing this today.
Australia shares the grave concerns that I've articulated previously about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Human suffering is widespread and it is unacceptable. Australia continues to condemn the ongoing acts of terror by Hamas, its use of human shields, its use of civilian infrastructure to launch attacks on Israel. We again reiterate our demand, which is reflected in the resolution, that Hamas release all remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally. Australia has consistently affirmed Israel's right to defend itself, and in doing so we have said Israel must respect international humanitarian law.
This decision applauded by the left and rightly denounced by Jewish groups which have accused Albanese of trying to have it both ways on the war. The Zionist Federation of Australia and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry said in a joint statement that either the government stands by its position that recognises that Hamas must be removed from power and return all the hostages, or it supports a ceasefire which would allow Hamas to remain in power and deliver on its promise to repeat the attacks of 7th of October at the earliest possible opportunity. And the Zionist Federation President Jeremy Liebler would join me on the show a bit later. Unsurprisingly, Teal politician Zoe Daniel came out today to say that she also supports a ceasefire. She said in a statement that as winter comes to Gaza, the humanitarian crisis will worsen and Australia can't simply stand and watch. Well, Zoe Daniel pretended to be a friend of Israel during the election campaign. We now know her true colours. Well, in Israel on a bipartisan trip is Labor MP Josh Burns, and he disagreed with his own government's decision. He said that a premature peace settlement would allow the terror organisation to regroup and pose an unacceptable ongoing threat to Israel. Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham is also on the trip with Josh Burns, and he had this to say.
It is one thing to be saying that you want a ceasefire, but the terms are the critical aspect there, and the terms have to be that Hamas releases all hostages, Hamas surrenders all arms, Hamas hands over its leadership and its terrorist operatives, and that ultimately Hamas is completely disabled.
Liberal MP Julian Leeser said that support for a ceasefire only prolongs Hamas's hold in Gaza instead of ensuring its days are numbered.
It prolongs Hamas remaining in power. This is a war about removing an organisation from power that we have listed as a terrorist organisation for several years in our own country. An organisation that murdered 1,200 Jewish people, the largest murder of Jews on a single day since the Holocaust. All this will do is keep Hamas in power. All this does is give Hamas time to consolidate and time to remain in power. The government has made this change because there has been a campaign in this country by the extreme Greens and their allies in inner city seats. This is more about Grayndler than it is about Gaza.
He makes an excellent point that the government's caving in to the extremism. I mean, only not that long ago, it was only the Greens who were calling for a ceasefire. Now it's Australia's official foreign policy position. Well, let's be very clear about what Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese are actually supporting when they side with the United Nations in demanding a ceasefire. Australia now supports a call for Israel to withdraw while its citizens are still being drugged and abused, while they're held hostage in dark underground tunnels, and while Hamas is still the governing body in Gaza, intent on destroying Jews. This decision today tells us that Australia, under Albanese and Wong, is a fair-weather friend of Israel. In its darkest hour, Australia has walked away from our closest ally in the Middle East. It's not just the darkest hour for Israel, but for Jews around the world. And at this moment of heartache, as the Jewish homeland came under unprecedented and unprovoked attack from a group that continues to repeat its aim to destroy Jews around the world, Australia under Albanese hasn't stood in our corner. Instead of having the moral fortitude to support Israel as it seeks to destroy the terrorists who invaded the homes of innocent families on October 7, Albanese, in demanding a ceasefire, has now meekly sided with terrorist sympathisers who want Israel to retreat and lay down arms. A move that will only have one repercussion: the emergence of a stronger and more emboldened Hamas regime, a murderous regime that will be fortified by the support of the United Nations, where an international coalition, in a state of moral confusion, has buttressed a barbaric genocidal group instead of giving strength to the peace-abiding democracy that is trying to defeat it in an increasingly lonely battle. This is stupidity from Albanese and Wong, with Albanese showing himself to be a more feeble leader than we could have imagined. And he's not alone. Even US President Joe Biden expressed concern overnight about Israel's approach, blaming Israel for losing support from the rest of the world. He had this to say as he stood alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
We have made it clear to the Israelis, and are aware, that the safety of innocent Palestinians is still of great concern. And so the actions they're taking must be consistent with attempting to do everything possible to prevent innocent Palestinian civilians from being hurt.
And of course, Israel is taking every possible action to protect civilian life. Let's articulate the moral reality here. In the same way that the West couldn't have agreed to a ceasefire with the Nazis, there cannot be a ceasefire with Hamas. The Nazi and Hamas regimes are equally as barbaric and murderous. If left unchecked, Hamas will only strengthen and grow. Its victims will increase in number. We all said never again after the Holocaust, and now is that time, never again. Western leaders like Albanese, and he's not alone, they need to have the courage, the clarity to say never again, and to stand with Israel and innocent Palestinians as the IDF defeats this terror group. I think it's important to revisit the speech today that the new US President Harry Truman gave at the San Francisco conference in April 1945, which was when the UN Charter was created. With high hopes for the United Nations, President Truman said that the new body would speak for people who've endured the most savage and devastating war ever inflicted upon innocent men, women, and children. He was, of course, speaking about the Holocaust, and of course he meant the Jewish people. He said, and I quote, "We must prevent, in human mind, heart, and hope can prevent it. If human mind, heart, and hope can prevent it, the repetition of the disaster from which the entire world will suffer for years to come. If we should pay merely lip service to inspiring ideals and later do violence to simple justice, we would draw down upon us the bitter wrath of generations yet unborn. We must not continue to sacrifice the flower of our youth merely to check madmen, those in who in every age plan would domination. The sacrifices of our youth today must lead, through your efforts, to the building for tomorrow of a mighty combination of nations founded upon justice, on peace." Yet the United Nations has today sided with the terror group, which is desperate for a ceasefire. Hamas is desperate for a ceasefire. It sided with Hamas rather than with Israel, that is trying to defeat Hamas in order to preserve the peace. With Australia's support, the United Nations calls for Israel to lay down its arms against those who've committed crimes against the peace. As we speak about the United Nations and its failings, I want to return to the eloquence of the former OECD economist, Henry Ergas, who wrote of the United Nations that the God of our dreams is also the God of our nightmares. He wrote in one of my favourite columns of his in The Australian that the UN's aspirations have gone up in flames, and he makes this vital point. As the United Nations descends into irrelevance, the laws of war, which were intended to protect the innocent, are being used to shelter the terrorists who deliberately place them at risk. Hailed as a triumph of civilization, they have become a tool facilitating barbarism's relentless advance. That leaves the people of Israel once again facing the fearfulness, the sense of danger, the perception of the struggle's ultimate character. Henry Oga says that the appeasers confuse a moral equivalence between victims and executioners, and he says that the Albanese government compounds this moral confusion. He says the single-minded focus on Israel obscures the atrocities that Hamas commits day after day, including by indiscriminately shelling Israeli homes, schools and hospitals. And Henry Ogas writes that the Albanese government's lack of clarity has the opposite effect. By relentlessly blurring the line between right and wrong, it gives Hamas's supporters a legitimacy that they don't deserve, and it fuels radicalisation that's tearing us apart. He writes, in the end, national unity demands moral direction, not moral equivocation. So too does our ability to face the future. For the unhinging of the nation's moral compass doesn't merely extinguish the courage to speak the truth, it erases the courage needed to see it. In a world that is far from being at peace, and where devastating cataclysms are not simply the painful memories of the old, but looming threats to the young, that doesn't just blind, it kills. We need to be clear. The devastation in Gaza is solely the responsibility of Hamas. Hamas planned the October 7 attacks for at least a year. It knew Israel would be forced to respond to defend its people, and Hamas deliberately interwove its terrorist infrastructure within the civilian population. It placed its weapons beneath hospitals and schools in its hope that the death toll of Palestinians, its own people, would be high to win over the sympathy of the international community. Hamas planned to rely on that international sympathy in order to wage war against Jews. The international coalition voting for a ceasefire at the United Nations is playing into the hands of Hamas. Worse, it's advancing its war strategy. The threat Hamas poses is not just to Jews, but to all of Western civilization, to the very values we have fought for and lost lives for over generations. Hamas's bloodthirsty leaders have made it clear that it won't stop at Israel. Its goal is to spread its extremist rule throughout the West.